So a couple of just sort of technical things before we begin and jump into the material today. First of all, we've got 96 folks on the line already. We've got about 120 registered, so that's too many to open our mics and ask questions. It's just if we try to do that, we'll never get through the rest of the material. So we want to invite you instead to interact with Deborah on the chat. If you haven't done that before, let me tell you how to find it. If you're on a computer, either a Mac or a PC, move your mouse over top of my picture and you'll see a bunch of icons come up at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And one of them is called chat. And you can click on that and the chat box will open. It'll probably defaults to being attached to the Zoom window. You can unattach it, move it around if you want to, play around with it. Whatever you do on your own screen would affect what anybody else sees, so you won't be changing things for us. And having said that, I'd invite you please to keep your mics off so that we don't hear sirens and dogs barking and all of those kinds of things. If you have technical questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll do my best to watch them and respond to them as they come along. And Deb and I have agreed that I'm going to kind of watch the chat so that she doesn't have to pay attention to it, and she'll pause from time to time and I'll kind of add in the comments that you've made. And I'll do my best to raise up representative comments. If we get 10 people saying the same thing, I may not name each person. But as we go along, I'll try to collect as many of those comments as I can. And if I miss yours, please accept my apologies. And if it's really important, put it in again. I might see it the second time around. Having said that, glad you're here, and thanks for being a part of this. We need to begin by inviting God to be into our midst. We need to begin by remembering the territories on which we sit, the variety of nations who have inhabited this land before my ancestors came, and probably before yours did too. And so to do both of those things, I'd like to invite you first just to think about the land you're sitting on today. Where are you located? Who has lived there before you did? Who cared for it? Who was cared for it? If you know the answer to those questions, put them in the chat, and we'll just sit and watch the chat for a minute and reflect on the history of the land and the history of the people and the connections that we make in the midst of all of that. I'm not going to read all of these today, partly because they're coming too quickly. And I'm realizing that normally I would be acknowledging the lands around what I call Aurora, the people of the New Credit and all of those folks. And I am a visitor in Montreal today, and I don't know, so I need to go and find out. But thank you. Thank you for being aware. Thank you for contributing. Thank you for acknowledging the history and the connection on the peoples who have been nurtured by these lands. And so as we gather, I want to invite you to reflect not only on the land, but also on your role in worship, on the issues of racism that unite us today, and on the ways in which this conversation happens, not just among people who organize stuff, but among people of faith. And so we invite God to be with us too. I'll bring up the candle that I use in worship with my own congregation. And if you have a candle, you might want to light yours too. We really invite God to be a part of our conversation. And so let us pray. God, who created all these lands and all these people, God who invites us into worship leadership, to lead with intention and with grace and with hope and with understanding, come be with us today. Come enliven our conversation, come deepen our understanding, come sing to our hearts and teach us your song. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So, Deborah, I'm going to bring you up and invite you to introduce yourself. I've got all of the publicity material and people have already read that. So tell us about why you're here and what kind of expertise you bring into our conversations, and then jump into the material. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And let me begin by saying I'm very happy to be here. I'm excited to share some thoughts with you and hear what you folks all think about this as we all work together to try to dismantle this system of racism that seems to have a stranglehold on society in North America and elsewhere around the world. I'm actually a lifetime church musician. I started as a child playing for prayer services on Wednesday nights in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I grew up. I studied piano and pipe organ. My degrees are in music education, and organ was my applied subject. When I eventually decided to do a doctorate, I'm a teacher. I've taught in schools and communities and continued working in the church, most of my life. I've been in the United Church since around 1991 in Canada. So when I decided to do my doctorate, the thing that spoke to me the most was the area of sociology and equity studies, and my specialty within that was anti-racism education. And right from the beginning, I thought I know that this affects everything that I do in my musical life and in my personal life, including my church life. And so some of the ideas that I have to share today have come from my own experience and the questions that I still wrestle with. So I hope you'll join me in wrestling with some of these questions too as we go along. So that's sort of a little bit about me. I'm now a member at Islington United Church in Toronto. Very happy to be there, and that was sort of how I got the connection here. The music director there, Jason Locke, and I crossed paths many years ago and have stayed in touch, and he connected me with Josh Zentner Barrett, who had asked me to write something for an upcoming issue of Gathering. And anyway, that sort of morphed into this. So I'm glad to be here, and I think we should probably get started. So our topic for the day is, our sort of guiding theme is, what is anti-racism and what might it look like in your music ministry? So I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay, good. So I'm going to start with, before we make any assumptions about what anti-racism is, I'm sure we all have some idea of what it is, but I have a particular definition that I like to use. It comes out of my academic studies, but it certainly applies to what we're doing here today. Anti-racism is an action-oriented, educational, and political strategy for institutional and systemic change that addresses the issues of racism, and the interlocking systems of social oppression, including sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism. There are others that we can add, racism based on issues of language, place of birth, many, many things can be incorporated into this notion of anti-racism, but it is, the salient feature here is the othering based primarily on skin color. And because racism is actually sort of a socially constructed thing, who those others are can vary from time to time. But that is the definition that sort of guides what I do. That comes from George Sifa Day, who's a professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. So when we think about these things, in music ministry, we've got a lot of things to deal with in the church. And so there are a couple of things that sort of might impede us from going straight ahead into, this sort of an anti-racism agenda, because we need to provide some sort of cultural translation for our congregations and an interpretation. How does a particular thing work in our own setting? What can it mean for us? But the key word in this definition of anti-racism is action. So in saying that, I want to emphasize that this is not a passive thing that we do. It does require forethought and for us to actually take some deliberate steps to try to bring in a perspective of anti-racism and an ethic of anti-racism into what we do in music ministry. So some of what I have to say today, you may find challenging. You are welcome to disagree with me, of course. And, there are things here that don't have specific answers. As I mentioned, we're all trying to find our way here and to figure out what is really the right thing to do, the best thing to do in a given situation. So it's not like you're going to walk away with a set of do this, 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 and this, and all of a sudden you're an anti-racist. No, it's more about things to think about. How do we approach these things in a way that honors the culture, another person, another group of people? One of the problems we run into in the church is that, that issue of time. And so what happens is we sometimes end up offering things sort of tokenistically. We try to incorporate other cultures, but we can only do it sort of sporadically. And in my understanding, that in itself constitutes tokenism. Tokenism is the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of equity within a workforce, institution, or other setting. Now, it's an effort, it is an action, but the problem with tokenism is that oftentimes no further action is taken to improve the diversity and inclusion policies of the organization. So if we think about that in a church setting, especially in a church music ministry setting, we can start to think about how might tokenism play out in what we do as music ministers. And I'm going to invite you to write in the chat as ideas come up. I'll start with a couple of examples, but if you can think right off the top of your head ways that we might be tokenizing other cultures and the music of other peoples of the globe in our own efforts here in worship, please share and we'll discuss those briefly. So one of the problems in music ministry, or one of the ways that tokenism plays out, is when we decide to do a special hymn from a culture on a designated Sunday. But then we never look at that hymn again for the rest of the year. So it might be singing a hymn from a First Nations or singing in one of the First Nations languages on Indigenous Peoples Sunday. If we never do it again, then could be considered a form of tokenism. And another form would be singing spirituals only during Black History Month. So, it seems right and natural to sing spirituals during Black History Month. But if that's the only time we sing them, why did we do it? What was our mission in doing it? So, do we have anything coming in on the chat? Any ideas from people?
There's a couple of things here, and maybe if I read them aloud, it'll encourage other people to add their own comments too. Andrea picks up the same comment you made about we sing those songs, she puts in quotes, only in Black History Month. And Patricia's a little more general, I thought was helpful, by not acknowledging the culture prior to singing the hymn.
Right. Because, congregations, oftentimes if we don't provide some context, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, they're going to go, why are we singing this? What does it mean? I didn't get anything out of it. I don't like that music. And it's not a real far jump from I don't like that music to I don't like the people who made that music. Right? So this is sort of the fine line we're trying to walk, right? We aren't necessary. It's easy to separate, and people who are, pushing back against anti-racism do make a point of separating these things, but it's a pretty narrow, thin thread that connects them. So easy one to break.
So Carol and Susan are both mentioning in different ways that we need to acknowledge that most of the songs we sing are European in background, and that's a culture too, and that we need to acknowledge the Eurocentricity of the songs in our sort of standard repertoire, and sort of acknowledge that as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, good. I was just going to say I'm really excited to see this coming up in the chat because we are going to talk about many of these things.
So Anne acknowledges we don't work very well with we don't collaborate with BIPOC musicians. So we always resort to bringing somebody in. And Andrea says, we always have the right people sitting strategically in our photographs so that we look diverse, or we put them on our committees.
Mm-hmm.
And Robin, I think raising an issue that I think you're going to address, is it appropriate for a largely white congregation to sing spirituals or music from a different culture generally? I think you're going to lead us through a discussion of that.
Right, and we're actually going to start talking about that right here in the next few minutes. So one of the things that I'm sure you've all heard this phrase a million times, music is a universal language, and variations of that. Music is the thing that connects us, right? We can all make sense of music. Well, yes, but is music really a universal language? As a couple of people have already pointed out in the chat, we all come from a culture. Well, all humans make music, but they make it in a way that speaks to them and whatever their cultural mores and traditions might dictate. So I want to explore this whole notion of how does culture become embedded in music, and starting with a recognition that even our own music from European traditions is itself representative of our culture. And we can think about that. What does it mean when we export those songs then to places that are far afield, like Asia, like Africa, like Micronesia? What are we actually accomplishing by doing that? And historically, what has been the purpose of doing that? So, we know that because all hymns have come from whatever culture they emerged from, they have that culture embedded in both the text and the music, in the melody and the harmony. And if you think about like church buildings around the world, they are all very different, but they all have elements of that local culture. The architecture will be reflective of the time period and the culture in which that church was originally built. And sometimes you see them with modifications as time has passed, so that you'll have a building that looks like it was originally built in 1850, and then a wing that looks like, yeah, that looks a little bit more like 1920, and the two things are combined. So that's sort of a physical manifestation of culture. In the United Church, we've got a lot of influences into the songs we sing. We are strongly influenced by the Anglican Church. Even very recently, we shared a hymnal with the Anglican Church of Canada that lasted, I dare say it's probably in the libraries of most United churches today still, and some churches may pull it out from time to time to recover a hymn that isn't in Voices United or More Voices. Historically, the United Church came together in 1925, and it was a union between the Methodist Church, the Congregational Union of Canada, a large portion of the Presbyterian Church of Canada. So we have those influences as well, plus the influence of the Anglican Church even recently and also historically as people immigrated to Canada from Britain. So how is Western culture embedded in our hymnody? Well, I'm going to give you an example here, but I also invite you, as you think of things that come up, put them in the chat so that we can, dig a little deeper on this conversation. But one of the things we want to think about that culture is embedded, it can be embedded actually in several ways. And with our concerns for Indigenous rights and the way Indigenous peoples in Canada have been treated historically and are striving for reconciliation, I think we need to make an acknowledgement that colonialism as a racist system has actually, filtered into many of the things that we sing in this country and other countries around the world. So this sort of map of cultural embeddedness comes from June Boyce Tillman. Maybe you'll recognize that name. She's the author of the lyrics of We Shall Go Out with Hope of Resurrection. Anyway, I heard her speak a few months ago, and she talked about the 4 movements of colonization that are evident today in the hymns of the Anglican Church. Now, she is speaking about the Anglican Church in Britain, but many of these hymns are in Voices United, so we'll just quickly run through that. There's nationalism. We've colonized the voice. Part of the effort of colonization was to control populations. So we colonize people's voices by style, by gender, by the way we expect them to sing, the intonation, the, sort of push to always sing in tune and on time, and don't make allowance for people who might do their own thing when it's time to sing. We colonize the body. We expect people to stand up straight and sing and hold their hymnal and not dance or move around or clap. And then we have the colonization of the environment. So if you think about the ways that many of our hymns talk about nature from the position of observing it from being afar, not being part of nature, not actually being part of that environment. And these are sort of historical traces that we can see still in our hymnody. So I see that the chat is busy. So Stephen, if you think we need to stop and talk about some of this, we will, but in the meantime, I'm going to go on. One thing I did want to mention before we get to Were You There, is that, we have some hymns from the Anglican tradition, and this one I want to come back to later, that give us an easy way to think about how is culture embedded. And one of those is Lift High the Cross. The very refrain of that, Lift High the Cross, is a reference to holding the crucifier who processes with the cross at the beginning of the service as he comes down the aisle. So it's a nod to a gesture that we still sing, but we don't actually do that in the United Church, or don't do it very often. I assume it probably happens once in a while. Anyway, I want to look at some other examples of cultural embeddedness. And one of my favorite hymns of all time anyway is Were You There? Now, this is a song that came out of the African American tradition. It is a song that was born out of slavery. And it's a really interesting song for us to consider because it asks us in a very specific way to think about what happened in our past and to ask us to bring it into our current lives today, to present it in today's world and to make sense of it today. So I think it's appropriate for what we're talking about today, which is very much about how has the past influenced what we're doing now. Now, within the music of Were You There, there are some things that are part of the song. The call and response, which is part of traditions of many cultures, and it is characteristic of African cultures and the music of African Americans. So in this version of Were You There, if you can see it, I realize this is very small, the call and response portions are maintained. Now, one of the other musical features of music of African Americans is this sense of moaning. So that part that goes, oh, is a throwback to African cultures where a lot of guttural sounds like and as well as moaning and wailing are part of the music itself. And also in this version we have free time, indicated here by the fermata, which don't necessarily have to be rhythmically treated. So there's that. And then we get to another version of the hymn, and this is where things start, we start messing with culture a little bit. This particular version of Were You There, the call and response has been removed, as has the free time element. No fermatas are here. The moaning reference is there because it's so much a part of the melody that we hear. I think it would be almost impossible to eliminate that. But when you take it, put it in strict time and without a call and response, it sort of becomes a standalone element. How is this hymn represented in Voices United? Well, it's sort of a hybrid. We have the call and response, we have the moaning, but the free time, the fermati, have been removed. So we're concerned about getting out of church in an hour and 10 minutes, so we don't hang on to any notes any too long. right? We keep it moving. So, that's just my little example about how culture might be embedded. What have comments in the chat been talking about, Stephen?
Yeah, thanks for asking. A couple of comments here. Let me just bring my video up. So, variety of different things here. I'm just scrolling back. Disembodied, highly intellectualized liturgy, says Jesse, can sometimes be really off-putting. But Lee goes on, I've been thinking a lot about colonized voice, the way voice production is taught in colleges, pretty and shaped voices, disembodied, intellectualized, and orderly, perfect rhythm, intonation, ways that we kind of impose our vision, I guess, on the music. Anne says, I find it interesting that we have no issues with choirs singing songs that are in Latin, Russian, Hebrew. The systemic oppressiveness with Black and Indigenous music influence acceptance of that music.
Interesting. That's a really interesting. Yeah. I mean, we do have. Do we have any hymnody that emerged out of Russia?
I don't know that we have hymnody, but certainly the choir that I sing in has sung in each of those languages and a couple of others.
Right, and we do find that often choirs will address something in a language. I know I myself have done one piece. I used to do it on Palm Sunday when I had a large enough body of forces to be able to do it, and it was English, it was in Latin, and it was in Hebrew, and the Latin and the Hebrew portions were from the blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna. But yeah, we sometimes pick and choose too, which cultures are perhaps easier for us to integrate. And I think that's often an issue of familiarity.
Aaron is acknowledging the hymn Were You There reaches my body in powerful ways during Lent or Good Friday. So it speaks to her soul. I don't know Aaron's cultural background. I think it speaks to my soul too, and it's certainly not coming out of my culture, and yet there's something visceral about it that moves me. So.
Yeah, I agree, and I think in that visceral reaction that it can cause is our opportunity, perhaps, to see in, to develop empathy for what other people have experienced, what was being experienced by the people who created that hymn, and how do we take that and let it inform what we do in our actions today.
Rick is appreciating the way you talked about the power of the fermata in Were You There, and wondering how many of us would know about the cultural significance of something like that. But sometimes, the effort to make our church music anti-racist lies with people like you, who are the leaders and producers of this kind of music. We need to know more about what we're doing and singing and seeing.
Right, and I think that's probably my big goal for all of us, is that we can all look at our own motivations and our own decisions and try to think about, is there another way that maybe we can do this? Am I doing it the best way possible for my congregation and for achieving a goal of anti-racism? So one
last comment,
sure.
and then I'll get out of the way. Kathleen, acknowledging how these pieces of music touch us, and I think she's engaging a little bit with your idea of music as a universal language. We sing these pieces not just because they're cultural artifacts of somebody else. We sing them because they move us.
Right.
And there is something powerful in that, so that we need to kind of hold on to that even as we acknowledge the culture of eroding. there's more coming in the chat even as I talk, and I better get out of the way and let you keep going.
Yeah, we'll move on really quickly. I had mentioned Lift High the Cross earlier, and I just want to touch on it really quickly. You know, this song was written back in the late 1800s. It was late in the 19th century at the height of British colonialism and just right as Britain was really expanding their reach across the globe. And you know that's this song, which many of us sing during Lent, and for Palm Sunday and Easter and Eastertide, originally was written with 11 verses that had all kinds of references to Britain's military might and the fact that the sun never set on the British Empire. So here's just a quick look at some of the original lyrics. Come, brethren, follow where our captain trod. The second verse talks about the hosts of God in conquering ranks. Newborn servants. Now this one, you know, there are ways to interpret this that don't tie it to colonialism, and but when one understands that at the time the countries who were colonizing actually believed that all the people born in of the country being colonized were actually servants of the empire, then that seemingly innocent phrase takes on a little bit of a different meaning. We talk about regaining the lost home. Again, Britain, you know, felt that they owned all those portions of the earth that they had colonized. Here we have whole earth references, north and south, east and west, every race and every language, farthest regions, let their homage bring, set up thy throne. Okay, we sing this hymn today. It's been modified quite a bit. Most of the verses have been dropped. And the United Church has their own version that is much less militaristic, although the music itself is very march-like, you know. Lift high the cross, strict 4, you know, keep moving. But some of that language is still here, right? Even in the refrain, all the world. We still have the conquering ranks from the original version, the newborn servant, the seal of him, and in the original version, that sense of seal, I think, was a reference to citizenship, because people born in the colonies were considered British citizens, even though when they tried to immigrate, they ran into great difficulty. So that's just a quick example of how these things get embedded in and then sometimes don't disappear real easily. So I want to move on now. I'm a little behind already. I knew that would happen. We want to talk about a question that someone else had raised earlier in the chat, and that is, how do we sing something like a Black spiritual or the music of any culture that doesn't feel like our own culture? How do we do it without being racist? So I'm going to invite you to start thinking about this, and please add comments into the chat, and I'll keep talking while you do that, and just give a couple of hints. For me, one of the most important things we talked, you know, a few people mentioned how deeply moved they can be by "Were You There?" Well, that hymn speaks to you. And it speaks to me, which is, I think, partly why I used it as an example. But if you see a hymn, and it's not one you're familiar with, but it tweaks your curiosity, so you learn it, you play it over, you listen to it, and you think, gee, I really like that. I like the message. I like the music. It's saying something to me. Well, chances are, if it's saying something to you, it could say something to somebody else as well. So if you want to start introducing music that you may not have used before, and it comes from a culture, somebody mentioned, know something, be sure and introduce it as music of a particular place. If you're not familiar with what that music sounds like generally, there's a wonderful resource called Smithsonian Folkways. And if you just Google Smithsonian Folkways, it'll take you right to that website. And although it's not real strong on sacred music or worship music, there are examples of music from all over the globe, from the subcultures of cultures. And you can do searches by title, by composer, but you can search by region, by country, by language, and there are always, you can always hear about 30 seconds of multiple examples of music from a given location. So if you want to kind of get a sense of what did this sound like in its home place, that's a good resource. Now, when I say that, I'm not suggesting we should try to replicate that in worship, because A, we can't, and B, it probably is going to come off sounding sort of hokey, maybe disrespectful. So that's not something that we want to do. So I'd say that the most important thing is, if the hymn speaks to you, you be able to think about what it is that speaks to you. Is it the beauty of the melody? Is it the richness of the text, even in translation? If you're venturing to do it in the original language, perhaps the sound of that language somehow gets to you. And, so these are all valid reasons for wanting to share this music in worship if you think it can enhance the worship experience. So, the couple of things I would say as we do this is, when you go to introduce it, and we're going to talk about how we're going to do that in a second, we're all going to collectively strategize that. Try to avoid the language that could be inferred as judgmental. So, sometimes if we're going to, teach a new song to the congregation and we want to encourage them to participate and join in, we go, oh, this rhythm is really simple, we can do this. But sometimes when we do that, those very words like, it's a simple melody or a tricky rhythm, these things are casting a judgment that feed back into this notion that European music, that classical music, is the be-all, end-all, and superior to every other form of music making on the earth. And we're still living with that. Somebody mentioned the way voices are trained in university. That is all part of that European tradition. And so we want to kind of avoid making judgments that can be construed as negative when we do this introduction. So I'm going to toss out a couple of examples, but I want to hear from you. How would you go about introducing another hymn? One that I've used is, I've had the choir when we had choirs, and in today's world with live streaming, maybe it's a soloist or a very small group, but have those folks sing something new as an introit for several weeks so that the congregation gets used to hearing it. And then use it in a service, and they already have a familiarity, at least with having heard the melody. Another easy way to do it, if you think it would work, is do it a verse at a time. Have the choir or a soloist sing the first verse or two, and then have the congregation join in. Okay, I'm going to stop planting ideas. I want to hear from you. How might you go about introducing something new? Please.
Ruth says our pianists are great at subliminal messaging with new music in the weeks prior and following. Jessica
Great.
says teach it to the congregation at children's time.
Hmm.
Lee says, call and response between the choir and congregation is always fun. Also, pianist improvising on the tune before service. And Catherine does call and response too.
Those are all, tried and true and excellent because they're interactive. I love the call and response thing. I've done that lots of times with congregations that I've worked with.
Kevin's just wishing we could be more comfortable with some teaching time in a worship service. Lining out a hymn, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And Lisa's remembering the organist at her last church had us sing the melody before adding words.
Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of strategies. For those who have taught music, a lot of those elementary music teaching strategies are really, really useful with congregations. Because, at heart, we're all children, right? It's not that those are strategies that work with children. They're strategies that work with everybody,
So
with anyone at any age.
Joanne is wondering, is this even a good thing to do? Or when is it cultural appropriation and when is it appropriate?
Yeah, that question of cultural appropriation it's a thorny one, right? And I think part of this is where we have to know what the culture is. If the culture does not freely share their music, then I would say, it would be hard for you to find something that you could use anyway. But yeah, if you know that culture doesn't freely share their music, as many First Nations cultures do not, their music is part of their sacred rituals, and they don't want them to be sung by people outside of their immediate community, then of course we shouldn't do it. To know if something's been appropriated, you can often tell by the copyright attributions, right? If it's credited to an author, then you know that probably it's been properly attributed. If it's been in the public domain for a long time, that's fine. But it's also, cultural appropriation is also it gets thrown up as a barrier sometimes at times when it doesn't need to be, because a great many cultures are very happy to share their music. For instance, out of Africa, most of those cultures and most of the hymns that we have that have come from Africa have been freely shared. And those folks are thrilled to share their music and have other people sing it and make it their own in some way.
And Andrea is kind of asking about the music in our hymn books and Voices United and More Voices. Can we assume that was freely shared and that we have permission then? That kind of checking has been done before it got published in one of our books?
Well, I would like to think so. Knowing a lot of the people who were involved in both of those projects, I would think so. So I think if it's in our hymnals, it's safe to use. I think, going beyond, check the attributions, do a little bit of research about the culture and make your own determination. We're not trying to force anybody to do something that makes them terribly uncomfortable, but at the same time, we also are trying to encourage people to move beyond the tribe, the little box of repertoire that we sometimes find, that we're in, the 75 to 100 hymns that we know and love, and those are the only ones we ever sing, right? And it's trying to move beyond that.
Well, and the folks online today who have been part of those hymn books and the committees, or the folks who are part of the new resource coming out in 2025, Then Let Us Sing, are saying, they worked really hard to get these permissions. But I think Jesse's comment is helpful here, and it echoes something you said to me the other day when we were talking this through. Jesse says, I think it's important to frame the why of what we're doing. Approaching any music with an invitation into the purpose of what we're doing is usually really helpful. You said that to me in about 5 different ways the other day when we were talking through this.
Right. Why do we want to sing it? What value do we think it brings to our worship? Why did that hymn speak to you to begin with when you were doing your searching for music? And those are important things to share, just, beyond what you personally think, but also the value that you see and the value that you think could be gained for the congregation to learn this.
There's a variety of other comments in the chat, but I think we should move on. So
I think we should move on as well.
Thank you to those of you who've read them, and God reads the whole chat even if I can't.
Right. And there's a way to save the chat at the end, right?
Absolutely, yes, there is.
Yeah.
I'll tell you about that at the end.
Okay, so I want us to break out, to go into small groups now and just spend some time thinking about what we've just been discussing so far for the past 50 minutes or so, 40 minutes, and think about this question. In light of what we have been talking about, what new strategies might you incorporate to introduce new music to your congregation? And is there anything you will change going forward? So I can put those in the chat if you want, while Stephen's doing the breakout.
Put those questions into the chat.
Yeah.
That would be great, because the chat persists when you go into breakout. And so when you get there, you can find that you all open the chat once you arrive, and you'll find that your questions are waiting for you there. Is there any questions about the chat before we go into
my
that?
typing is so okay, there we go.
So I have put the put you into small groups. There will be 3 or 4 people in each of the small groups. Up in the top right corner of your screen, you'll see a countdown clock that tells you how much time you have left. I've set it for 10 minutes. So as you're moving through the groups, please make sure that you're watching the clock and that everybody has a chance to speak before the 10 minutes is up. Oddly enough, 10 minutes flies by. Okay, so welcome back, folks. We're glad you're here. And just as we gather back together, maybe put a couple of the aha learnings into the chat. What jumped out in that conversation that was so important or new that you'd like to share it with the rest of them? One group talked about the Huron Carol.
Type in, or are you picking someone to talk?
No, what we'd like you to do is put your comments into the chat, please, and then we can collect lots of them. If we pass the microphone around, everybody will talk for at least a minute, and we'll be through our last 20 minutes without hearing from everybody. And I think
we have one more thing we want to talk about.
But there you go. So one group talked about the Huron Carol. That's an interesting.
That's a really good example of a hymn that is beautiful. People love to sing it, yet it's got a little bit of a complicated history for our use.
And an ambiguous usage, even among the cultures in which it arose. I mean, there are some Aboriginal congregations who cannot celebrate Christmas without it, and others that will not touch it with a 10.
That won't touch it, right?
Yeah. So it makes it complicated for those of us who aren't Aboriginal.
right. I
Oh
had
my
a
goodness, these
community.
comments are coming in fast. I don't know if I can
Ooh,
read them
they
and
are.
memorize them. I want to explore different cultures, move forward in good ways with education. How do we do this without being racist? Take the pressure
That's
off Sunday, find other venues to do new music. Excellent secular pieces which could be incorporated in a service. What about including actions or instruments as a way for people to engage with their bodies, get out of their heads?
mm,
There are new Indigenous words that are culturally appropriate to the Huron Carol. That's important.
hmm
We had a valuable article in Broadview a couple of years ago about the Huron Carol. Importance of repetition of new pieces, drawing from online resources. You
Absolutely.
can't just sing it once and assume your congregation is going to know it.
Exactly. That's a good segue into the next section, so we'll keep that in mind.
Are we going to talk about language, says somebody. Lydia Smith had an article somewhere about racist language in our Advent and Christmas hymns. Her article was about light and dark, as I recall, which is really powerful.
Mm,
Made me
right.
think differently about all of that light and dark imagery that you find in Advent and Christmas and Epiphany.
Right. And, you know, I mean, in the English language, those words do have racist connotations. And, you know, where Black people were defined as being dark, and things that are dark are associated with being bad, as they are in our theology. But when it gets ascribed to races, you know, people of light skin are naturally better than people of dark skin. This is a problem, and we do have to kind of think about how things have been set up. What's the history with the song? What did it mean then, and what does it mean now? Do we reinterpret it?
Couple of comments here. Jesse is saying we've talked a lot about spirituals, but what about the more diverse modern expressions like hip hop, R&B, electronic music, and so on? You don't see a lot of those in more voices, but maybe that's something we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I definitely. You know, if you have people in the congregation who are really into that music and you know it well, and you know, even want to write something for congregational use, I mean, I'm sure the youth of the congregation would really be excited for that, and that would help build towards, you know, future generations. I mean, we haven't, lots of things we don't touch.
So Ian is asking you to articulate again, and maybe this is helpful, the connection between your invitation to talk about how do we introduce new hymns and the topic of racism. What are we trying to avoid? What are we trying to do instead? What's the connection between the conversation in the small groups you asked us to do and being anti-racist?
It's a great question. Thank you, Ian. Yes, you know, part of what we want to accomplish when we are looking beyond, you know, our standard tried and true hymns to the music from other cultures is a recognition, both physically, intellectually, of all of us being God's children, all of us on the planet. And part of anti-racism work is to build towards not just acceptance, but actual connection with others. Of course, it starts with acceptance, and this is perhaps one step towards acceptance. If we can expand our own repertoire of music and become more comfortable singing things that are outside our familiar boxes, it puts us one step closer to then being able not only to accept the people of that culture, but to begin to understand them in some small way. And learning one piece of music or 5 pieces of music from a culture is not going to give you cultural understanding. That's a myth that has gone around music education circles for a long time. But it puts us in a frame of mind that makes us more amenable to learning about those with whom we haven't had much in common before. And in that learning, we find out we actually all have a lot in common with each other as human beings. And we let these other things, these structural things, these societal definitions that get imposed upon us affect how we think about other people. You know, because we put them in boxes of Black people or people from Asia or people of the First Nations, and those come with stereotypes. So part of this is part of the effort to learn something about another group and remove the stereotypes from that learning, to encounter it from sort of a ground zero perspective.
So in a nutshell, in 60 seconds, challenge from Ian, can you give us an example of how you've done that? What was the most recent piece of music you introduced to your congregation, and how did you do it in a way that you hoped or trusted would be culturally sensitive and not racist?
Well, you know, the last congregation that I served, I've been retired from them since 2014, but it probably would have been a song from South Africa, because I'm quite familiar with a lot of that repertoire. And I taught it by having the choir sing it. We sang it in both English and Shona. Once the choir had sung it several times, we used it as an introduction to prayer. Then eventually we got the entire congregation to sing it. We sang it first in English. Once the congregation seemed comfortable singing it in English, then I also taught the Shona language, and I actually did it by call and response. You know, I spoke the words, had the congregation repeat it, and then I'd sing the words to the tune and have the congregation repeat it. And we learned several pieces of music that were not in the standard repertoire that way. So, and they became part of what we sang more regularly.
Thank you. And not just on the culturally appropriate days.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, looking
Thank you.
at the clock. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
let me get out of the way. And thanks to all of you who have written in the comments. I'm gonna let God read the rest of them, and so you carry on there, please. So, yeah.
I'm definitely going to read them too. I'm so thankful that everyone is thinking about these issues. We want to do one final thought exercise here before we go, and we've only got about 10 minutes, and then we'll have to wrap up. Well, not even. So I'd like you to think, and you can answer in the chat, and we'll talk as we go along as the answers come in. Now that we've talked about all of this and talked about a strategy for introducing, how might you avoid tokenism in the future? Considering the realities of the structure of a worship service and the time limitations, what you need to do for worship planning and liturgical seasons, combined with how you want to expand your congregation's repertoire of music. So what can you do that perhaps you haven't done in the past to avoid tokenism? So please put your answers in the chat and we'll call them up. And the first thing I see is definitely, you know, the key. Keep doing the song.
Yeah, use it more than once.
Right.
Nobody learns a song by singing it once.
Right.
Making a diverse sourcing a regular practice when constructing the liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
invite a guest musician to sing and play as an example.
Right. And with the guest musicians, I mean, I think that oftentimes gives us a sense of authenticity of culture if we can find a culture bearer or somebody who is really well versed in that culture. The trick then is to not leave it just with them, but to get everybody involved, you know, to use that as a teaching moment and then to be able to keep using that music even when the culture bearer isn't there with you.
You know, Ruth made a comment earlier, which I think is an answer to the question you hadn't quite asked yet. She's wondering about using a piece of music as a teaching point for unpacking some of this other colonialization stuff. So sharing some of what you've talked about, even in a sermon.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that the new selection is within the capability of the choir and the congregation.
Right.
So nobody's stumbling on it. They can feel confident about it. Thanks, guys.
Right. Right.
Or inviting different cultural groups to guide us in doing it respectfully, especially if they're sitting in the pews.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know, for some of the songs that might be a bit trickier, and this is true of a lot of contemporary Christian music, the chorus, the refrain is very accessible, but the verses are, you know, complicated sometimes. And there's a way sometimes to combine those things. If you have someone of the culture who can do the verses, but everybody can join in on the refrains, right? And that way we're still including the music and breaking down some of the barrier of, oh, it's too hard.
Rick is saying, don't just name the source of the culturally diverse song. Name the source of every song we sing. Every song has a culture. You deconstruct the us and them mentality. It's not that my culturalism is normative and everybody else is exotic.
Right. And in doing that, it gives us an opportunity to deconstruct some of the problematic histories that we might still have in our hymn repertoires. We can talk about the colonialism of a hymn like Lift High the Cross and show how it's been modified through the years to be something that we can sing with conviction.
Faye says, sing the original language first rather than second. Broaden the musical instrument resources, says Ian. Encourage comfort with movement and clapping, willingness to explore.
Amen to that, Ian.
Have hymn sings once a month. That's an older tradition. It used to be a great time to introduce a new hymn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hymn sings are lovely. I love them. And I think a lot of congregations really enjoy them as well.
Also, the ideas that are coming up in the chat. Deborah, is there anything else you'd want to add to those?
I was just looking over to see if there was something to pick up on. The comment about sing the original language first, I think, you know, that works really well in some places. It may not work as well in others. And that's where you need to know how brave is your congregation? How much encouragement do they need? And if they're prone to question, why are we doing this? Then you might want to start with a good English version of it, or whatever the language is in your congregation, if it's French or something else, you know. So it's a judgment call. There's some, you know, but I'm a big fan of singing the original language, as I mentioned to Stephen. When you hear the text of an original language with the melody, you, I think, get a better sense of how the people who originated the music, how they felt singing it. And sometimes there's a very visceral response that you might get from certain sounds landing on particular notes, the vibrations that are created. So I'm all for encouraging singing in the original language, especially if you're comfortable teaching it. if you know the language well, or if you have people in the congregation or other resources that you can draw on to ensure that you're, able to pronounce it correctly and teach it correctly.
Kathleen is appreciating that being online has given her congregation a chance to learn a bunch of new stuff.
Mhm.
And I think that's true for mine too. I think one of the things we've learned in my congregation is how valuable it is to have a song leader, which is something more evangelical congregations do and that mine hadn't done before, but I think we will continue. To have somebody actually singing as well as just having the pianist or organist play has helped
Right.
the worshiping congregation feel a part of it and be able to sing along, even if they're singing at home and can't be heard on Zoom.
Right. Yeah, I think, being online has opened up some opportunities. It isn't all just a defensive response. I'm looking at Chelsea's comment here, and yeah, we sometimes get ourselves tripped up in worrying so much about issues of cultural appropriation. And I don't say that to minimize that. It is an issue. If music isn't, acquired lawfully, or if it's taken from people without their permission, that's not a good thing. But we really don't want to put up a roadblock where there doesn't need to be one. And there, as long as we keep trying and our hearts are in the right spot for wanting to do this, because we want to understand better how other folks in the world engage with God musically, and if in that learning that helps us understand something about the way we engage with God, then I feel like it's really worth the effort that it takes. And it does take some effort. But you folks clearly are willing to go that and put some effort in, and that's really encouraging.
We have about 5 minutes left. Was there anything else on your list, Deborah, or should we just kind of invite the folks who are here to make comments?
I think we can do that. Yeah, that we got through my long list of major points. There's many other things we could have talked about today, but this I'm glad we engaged with these.
I feel like we just opened the conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
The nuts and bolts of this are something you live into over years of planning liturgies and working with choirs and stuff. But I wonder if this, for those of you who are online, and a lot of you are in music worship and leadership, like I am week by week by week, anything else jumping out of you in this conversation that you'd like to add or comment on or ask Deborah before we close off? Now's the time. We've got about 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Checking hymns for non-binary pronouns, absolutely.
Yeah, that's, boy, there could be some rewrites
deeply into language in hymnody and worship. Interesting. I have become very aware recently how every hymn book edits words. If you look at the history of a Charles Wesley hymn, every edition is different. And so it has made me realize how hymnody evolves with the church's theology.
Right. And we have a difficulty with that now because of copyright laws. And I'm thinking here of the hymn In Christ Alone, where Townend and Getty, I know that the Presbyterian hymnal in the States wanted to include that hymn, but they wanted to change the line about the wrath of God. And the authors, the composers refused. They said, no, we meant the wrath of God. And so therefore that hymn was not included in the hymnal because of copyright. And yet I know an awful lot of congregations, including in the United Church, love that hymn. And I don't know what they're doing about the wrath of God, if they're making their own changes that aren't really legal, or not thinking about the wrath of God as they sing it, but
Complicated, isn't it? I mean, as a pastor, I want to say that our hymnody becomes a vehicle for our worship. So it has to reflect our theology.
it does, yeah.
And yet we
Yeah.
want to be respectful of authors whose work is not in the public domain.
Yeah, it's tricky, and that hymn, I know, I personally love it. I have a problem with that line, "the wrath of God," but there's something about singing that hymn that does something for me, you know. So.
And in Canada, of course, we're more and more connecting with First Nations people. So what about incorporating drumming, language inflections in new pieces? Is that cultural appropriation? Is that respectful? How do you wend your way through that one, Deborah?
Yeah. Well, again, if depending on which First Nation it is from, and if they are, as a group, offering that music for use outside of their own community, then I would say, if you're going to do drumming and the vocalizations that often are characteristic of that music, are you doing it because you know how that music goes? This is what I was talking about, listening to some examples on Smithsonian Folkways. First Nations drumming, you know, has been stereotyped as always being lump, bum, 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 lump, bum, 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 and it's not. It's very different, and every tribal group has their own particular drumming patterns that they use. So that's an instance where I think we might be better served in some cases of singing in a language, but with a hymn that we already know, rather than trying to incorporate that music, unless we have a group that we can invite in to share and they're willing to come in and share. And I think that's a big thing with a lot of First Nations is they're willing to share as long as they're involved. What they're not willing to do is just give away, because they've had so much taken from them historically. So a lot of it is about involvement and setting up those respectful communications and you know, actions of inclusion.
I think that's the appropriate way to end today's program, because I think that lies at the core of everything you've been saying from the beginning to the end, Deborah. It's, we're not here to take. We are here to share stuff that has been freely shared. And we shouldn't be ashamed to share things that we have permission to share, and we should be working hard to make sure that we have that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for all the work you put into preparing this and for inviting the rest of us into this conversation. Thank you to those of you online for your comments, for your engagement, for the ideas you put into the chat, for the small group conversation that I know brought in things that didn't even end up in the chat. Important conversation to be having as worship leaders as we reflect on how the worship that we create can bring meaning into the lives of the people in our pews.
Absolutely. That was so well said. And I just want to add that I so appreciate all of you hanging in and engaging and asking thoughtful questions and contributing your thoughtful comments and your experiences and sharing them with all of us. And hopefully we all have something that we can continue to think about going forward.
That draws to a close our program for today. I don't imagine this will be the last time we talk about this topic, and I'll look forward to seeing you again on a future webinar. Blessings on your ministry, and we'll say good day for now.